For much of my life, I struggled to rid myself of negative thoughts and emotions, and yet everything I tried, nothing seemed to work. In fact, it seemed that the more I struggled, the more these things would persist, and in addition to that was all of this judgment, which has its own emotional charge. And being a spiritual seeker, as long as I was experiencing these things, it seemed to be an indication that I was doing something wrong, that I was failing in my spiritual practice, that I was falling short of the spiritual ideal. But as time went on, I started to wonder if maybe the problem was in my own way of thinking, in my way of approaching all of this, and in particular, this idea that we have to rid ourselves of these things. Something that many spiritual teachers talk about is inner freedom. Freedom from thought, freedom from suffering. And I had tended to interpret this to mean that to be free from something means that you never experience it, you never encounter it. It doesn't arise in you. And since suffering arises in the form of unpleasant emotions, such as anger, anxiety, sadness, and so on, for one who is free, these things don't arise in them. But eventually I began to realize that this was a misunderstanding, and that to be free from something doesn't mean that it no longer shows up. It simply means that it no longer has power over you. It means that even when it does show up, it doesn't take hold of you. It doesn't dominate you. You're not consumed by it. So the problem wasn't that these emotions would arise in me from time to time. The problem was that I hadn't learned how to live with them. The problem was that I was always trying to get rid of them, or trying to escape from them, to avoid them, rather than simply understanding them. So I began to take an entirely different approach, which was to simply allow these emotions to arise without interfering, without resisting them. And not to suggest that this is easy, because when your tendency for so long is to resist them, it takes quite a bit of practice to break that tendency. In fact, I still find that resistance there at times. And when I notice it, I just acknowledge it, and I go ahead and allow space for the emotion to be there. And the more that we allow space for it, the more the resistance dissolves. Because that's what the resistance is. It's the non-allowing of it. It's the non-acceptance of it. So the more we allow and accept, the less resistance there is. Now, part of the resistance is that we might tend to find ourselves feeling overwhelmed by these emotions. Or we may find that they tend to linger for a very long time. And so maybe there's some fear that if I just allow the emotion to be there without resisting it, it might never go. I might be stuck with it for the rest of my life. And that seems to make sense to the rational mind. If all I'm doing is allowing the emotion to be there, then it only makes sense that it's going to remain there forever. If I'm not making any effort to get rid of it, then what is there to keep it from staying? But paradoxically, the opposite tends to happen. That when we allow space for the emotion without interfering, it tends not to linger for very long. It tends to go all on its own. In fact, it seems that the more we struggle against it, the longer it hangs around. But if we don't engage with it, if we just allow space for it to arise and to remain within that space, we're also allowing it space to go. And the more space that we allow, the less it tends to overwhelm us, because rather than being consumed by it, we begin to see it as a passing phenomenon, passing through the field of awareness. The analogy that I like to use is to think of the emotion as a cloud. And we'll often say that we feel clouded by some emotional experience. It can feel as if we're in the midst of a thick fog. And that makes it very difficult to see clearly or to see anything beyond that fog. Or at least whatever we can see, we see it through the filter of that fog or that emotion. And so it distorts our perception. Now, the reason for this is that our awareness is contracted to a very small point within that cloud. But if we can expand our awareness so that instead of being encompassed by the cloud is encompassed by the greater field of our awareness, the cloud becomes smaller in relation to the vastness of the space in which it exists, and therefore it no longer consumes you. It's no longer overwhelming. In that expanded awareness, there is the emotion, but there is so much more than that. The emotion is just one of many things occurring within the field of awareness. It's just a passing cloud, passing through the open sky. And this is another common analogy, that you are the sky, and everything else is just the weather. And no matter what the weather, the sky remains unaffected. The weather is always changing. Sometimes it's cloudy, sometimes it's clear, sometimes there's a storm. But eventually it passes. And while the weather is always changing, the sky remains as it is, simply the space in which it all occurs. So when we're able to be that space of awareness, whatever emotion you may be experiencing, it's just a passing phenomenon. And you don't have to try and get rid of it. It will pass all on its own. Now, it may not always go immediately. It may hang around for a while. But eventually it will go. And in the meantime, so long as you can see it as something happening within the larger field of your awareness, you don't have to be consumed by it. You can just notice it, acknowledge it, and observe it. But this idea that there is a state in which negative thoughts and emotions never arise, I'm not sure that such a state exists. Maybe it does, but maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it's not about being in a state in which these things never arise, but rather being in a state in which even when these things arise, we aren't consumed by them. We simply recognize them without investing so much importance into them. We just don't take them too seriously. Another analogy that I find really useful is to think of our emotions as children. And in some sense, it is our own inner child. Because when you really observe your emotions, you notice that it's still the child in you. When you were a child and there was something that you wanted and you couldn't have, you would be upset. And now, as an adult, when there is something that you want and you can't have it, you get upset in very much the same way. Just notice this. But anyway, the idea is to see our emotions as if they're children, as if a child has come to you feeling upset. feeling sad or angry or frightened. And how might you respond to that child? Probably, or at least hopefully, you would receive them with loving kindness, with compassion, with tenderness, without judgment. And you might comfort them, letting them know that it's okay for them to be feeling whatever it is that they're feeling in that moment. Or simply providing them the space in which they're allowed to feel any sort of feeling without being rejected, without being criticized or condemned, without being shamed, or simply holding space for them. And in that space, there is a willingness to listen. In fact, we might even inquire, why do you feel upset? And so we listen to whatever it is that they're trying to communicate. And it may be something very important. There may be something that needs to be addressed. There may be a problem that needs to be resolved. It may be that they have a valid reason to be upset. Or it may be that they're upset because of their own unreasonable desire or expectation. And if you can see that, you might simply help them to see it as well. Or it may be that they just need to vent. And maybe there's nothing that can be done, and they just need to talk about it. They just need to express it, or they just need to cry for a little while. And maybe it's enough to just allow them the space to do that. But whatever the case, you don't turn them away. You don't try to silence them. And you don't try to rush them either. You allow them whatever time they need to process whatever they're feeling. And if you just meet them with kindness and with gentleness, with love and understanding, sometimes that's enough to resolve it. Sometimes that's all they really need. Sometimes the reason they're feeling upset in the first place is because they weren't feeling loved. The thing is, our emotions are trying to communicate something, and it's worth taking the time to listen. And that doesn't mean that what they're communicating is true. Oftentimes, it may not be. I think the problem for a lot of us is that we tend to assume that what is being expressed is true without questioning it. So whatever emotion we're experiencing, notice how there are certain thoughts which accompany it. And notice what those thoughts are communicating, but don't assume that they're true. Be impartial, like a therapist listening to a patient, free from assumptions, free from judgment, just listening and asking questions. If the thought is something like, I'm no good, we're not going to automatically assume that this is true. We're going to take some time to examine that statement and find out. We're going to ask, what is the basis of that thought? What evidence is there to support it? And is there any evidence to refute it? If you want to find out whether or not something is true, you have to challenge it. You have to explore whether there's anything at all that might refute it. So with this example, you might ask, is there anything at all that is good about you? Is there anything you've done which is good? Do you have any good qualities at all? And if there are, well then, the statement is false, isn't it? Or maybe you think, I did something bad, and that cancels out all of the good things. But according to that logic, all the good things that you've done should cancel out the bad, or rather, they cancel each other out. Which is to say, maybe you're not good or bad. Maybe you're a mixed bag, just like everyone else. And maybe the fact that you feel bad about doing something wrong is an indication that there is good in you. Because if there wasn't, you wouldn't feel bad about it. Sometimes it's not just the thought which accompanies the emotion, but what the thought implies, or rather the judgment that we have about it. For example, it might be a thought like, I don't have a partner, or I don't make very much money, or I don't have my own place, or I'm lacking in some particular skill. And these kinds of statements may be factually true, but the question is, why does that disturb you? Why do you feel upset about it? Why does that make you feel sad or depressed? Suppose the issue is that you don't have a partner, and there's no denying this fact. But is it the fact itself which is causing you to feel sad, or is it something else underlying the fact? Maybe you see that everyone else you know has a partner except for you, and maybe you feel this sort of social stigma, that you feel left out or you don't measure up. Or maybe you just don't like being alone for some other reason altogether. Maybe there's something deeply uncomfortable about it. So what is that? Find out. The point is that emotions are always telling us something. Sometimes what they're telling us is true, and sometimes it's not. And sometimes it's something obvious, while other times it's pointing us to something much deeper in ourselves. Perhaps to something buried or forgotten, or something we've been avoiding in ourselves. Some old unhealed wound or insecurity, or some attachment or belief that we need to let go of. But until you go into that and explore it, it continues to affect you in a very unpleasant way. It keeps getting triggered. And it will go on being triggered until you resolve it. So it's always worth listening to our emotions in order to better understand them. But in order to do that, you have to create a bit of space. You have to be able to step back and observe. And of course, that requires that you allow the emotion to be there without resistance, without the idea that it shouldn't be there or that you need to get rid of it.